Joining us now is Ambassador Alon Pinkas, the former Israeli Consul General in New York, former advisor to Israeli Prime Ministers Ehud Barak and Shimon Peres. Ambassador, we're also hearing, of course, about new proposals for a pause in the fighting of different durations to release hostages. There are different time frames for a pause. Hamas still demanding a permanent ceasefire, Israel putting up objections obviously to a permanent ceasefire, which they object to, but also raising issues about what happens after the fighting, which are very objectionable to Hamas. But are they getting closer to a hostage agreement? Is there an impetus on both sides to wanting a pause in the fighting?
Yes. Hi, Andrea. Yes, you're right. There seems to be an impetus on both sides to get some deal done. Now, as for the varying durations of the ceasefire or the cessation of hostilities or prolonged pauses, which are all euphemisms for the same thing, the question is, Andrea, whether or not they are linked to the to post-war Gaza. And if you happen to have read David Ignatius' article yesterday in the Washington Post, he outlines and articulates the American thinking within the administration on how to tie a hostage deal and a cessation of hostilities into a longer ceasefire without any side having to concede that they agreed to a ceasefire. And that would be somehow linked to a post-war day after Gaza. Now, that, I think, is still far away. However, a hostage deal mediated by primarily the Qataris, also Egypt with American encouragement and involvement, seems to be resurrected after a few weeks of nothing going on there.
Having traveled with Secretary Blinken through the region, he was keeping them on parallel or different tracks, different timeframes. Hostage deal first, day after, right, and normalization and all the rest. But then in Davos, a number of the Arab countries were pushing the idea that these two should be linked. But I want to ask you also on Friday the tragedy of a 17-year-old American teenager born in Louisiana, living in the West Bank. His father's also an American citizen, killed in the West Bank. Our colleague Raf Sanchez interviewed the father, showed the windshield of the car. The family insists that he was shot by an Israeli settler, that the IDF did nothing to protect him. There are denials from Israel. Is Israel investigating this?
Well, the army is investigating, and I saw the report by Raf Sanchez, and it is a tragedy, like you say, and it could have been avoided. Look, there has been criticism within Israel, obviously outside of Israel, but also within Israel, even before October 7th, that the settlers, that some settler elements have been going on, violent sprees, and that the military, the IDF, has done very little to stop them, was indifferent to their actions, and even in some cases was encouraging them. Now these were very isolated incidents, but nonetheless, it all accelerated since October 7th because the West Bank all of a sudden became an arena that could, be a focal point of escalation, and it still remains that way. So, yeah, per your question, Andrea, it is being investigated. Whether or not Joe Schmo will be held responsible, I doubt it.
Meanwhile, there's been a lot of disagreement between European Union, European foreign ministers and the EU and Israeli counterparts on what happens the day after. Israel's now talking with some of the right-wing ministers talking about the creation of an island, which also suggests some resettlement, which is a non-starter for the U.S. And Israel is now, we've just heard that the International Court Criminal Court of Justice, rather, in The Hague, is going to rule on this Friday morning, yes, our time, on that South African genocide petition, which is just rousing a lot of concerns in Israel among the officials I talked to. It's not binding, but there are penalties.
Well, it is binding. Actually, it is binding, Andrea. What they're about to decide is not a final verdict. That takes a year, maybe 2 years. What they've been asked by the South African petitioners was to issue an injunction of sorts or a provisional decision, say, calling for a ceasefire on humanitarian and medical grounds. If they so decree, then it is binding. If Israel does not adhere and comply with that decision, then it moves to the Security Council, because the ICJ operates, and its source of authority is the United Nations Security Council. In the Security Council, Israel, as always, relies on an American veto. Now, this is going to put the Biden administration in the bind here, because on the one hand, they have been vociferous and consistent in their objection to calling what's going on in Gaza genocide. And there's been a petition, a letter from members of Congress to that effect, over 200, if I remember correctly. However, the entire prosecution of the war, Andrea, in the last 2 months has not been something the Americans have really supported. I mean, they have urged Israel time and time again. Indeed, Secretary Blinken, that you interviewed a few just weeks ago, said that they are not happy with how the military operation is going on. They never called for a ceasefire, although they don't call it genocide, but they have never called for a ceasefire. If it does reach if such a decision is made and it does reach the Security Council, it's a big headache for the Biden administration. It's going to be a big headache.
They would have to veto it because the word genocide is so loaded. They'd have to veto it. But you're absolutely right. It's not binding. What I mean is that there's no enforcement. They can't force Israel to stop fighting. But the fact is it would be a huge embarrassment, and it's politically toxic. Just last night at his big rally with the vice president, there were protesters again, about a dozen times, interrupting his rally. So it's beginning to affect the campaign. More to come.
It does.
It's always good to see.
You look at the numbers in Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, younger people, they're saying that's their issue. I don't know if that's going to stay until November, but right now it is.